The last big day of every year for the Aston Martin Owners Club is the Autumn Concours d'Elegance, which in 1965 took place with the blessing of the Queen's cousin, AMOC member the Honourable Gerald Lascelles, at his home, Fort Belvedere, on the Berkshire-Surrey border. A royal home best known as the discreet hideaway used by the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, when he was courting the divorced Mrs. Simpson. Brian Jocelyn arrived early to get the organisation underway, laying out class position markers in the drive. Chairman Dudley Coram was another early arrival, and as the others turned up, the final spit and polish really got underway. One man hard at work was Alan Archer, who showed he can get Aston Polisher's elbow along with the best of them. The Concours is always a real family outing, but if you're not wanted for polishing duty, you are allowed a little rest. Alan appeared to be getting on to his second bottle. Polish, of course. And then came a famous car, LM21. The 1.5-litre Bertelli-designed Astons finished 5th at Le Mans on 3 consecutive occasions in the 1930s. The splendid trophy array meant that nearly everyone would get some suitable reward for all their efforts. Even one for that man Archer. As the time for the judging approached, the younger element checked out the fort's defences. And with all aspects of the car's appearance to inspect and test, the judges have their work cut out as they peer into every nook and cranny of every Aston Martin. The vintage machinery may be more get-at-able than the modern, but it has therefore to be polished down to the last available nut and bolt. And still the judges may not be satisfied. The club was immensely grateful to Gerald Lascelles for allowing the use of Fort Belvedere for this concours, and to his lady wife for presenting the trophies and awards. In 1966, my first outing was to the wide open spaces of Silverstone, and another new era for Formula One, the 3-litre formula, of which more in a minute. The sports car lineup included Denny Hume in Sid Taylor's Lola T70. Power is by 6-litre V8 Chevy. Bruce McLaren, fully recovered from his painful burns of last year, had a new Mark 1B with more bulbous bodywork, designed by the artist Michael Turner. Bruce had been second fastest in practice. David Hobbs was driving the Team Surtees Lola in place of Graham Hill. American Skip Scott had an Essex wire-entered Ford GT40, and Yorkshireman Peter Sutcliffe had his own privately entered green GT40. The leading cars had all gone faster in practice than the 3-litre Formula One car. David Proffitt stood by his McLaren, equipped with fuel injection and scaffolding poles. How you can see anything out of the back of a GT40, I will never know. With a minute to go, around 10,000 horsepower burst into life, and then the 22-strong field was on its way. Denny Hume's opening lap averaged 111 miles an hour from a standing start, and he was well away by the time they got back towards Woodcote. Denny went on to break John Surtees' lap record on only his second tour. The McLarens were second and third, with Chris Amon having a stretched 5-litre Oldsmobile motor ahead of team boss Bruce. Briefly, Peter Sutcliffe led Scott in the GT prototype class. As David Hobbs was forced out with no clutch on the Surtees Lola, Brian Redman was going great guns in his Lola, moving up to fourth behind the two McLarens. Peter Sutcliffe was dropping back in his GT40, and the GT prototypes were now being led by Skip Scott, ahead of David Piper's 330 Ferrari. David Proffitt was pressing on as fast as he could go in his McLaren Elva, as Hugh Dibley began to challenge Redman's fourth place. Meanwhile, the leader, all on his own, was breaking the circuit record with monotonous regularity, finally leaving it at nearly 119 miles an hour, 4 miles an hour quicker than Surtees had managed in the 1965 Martini Trophy. Hume duly took the checkered flag, and we turned our attention to the Formula One race. After more than 5 years of 1.5-litre racing, which was something the skeptics had warned would be little more than glorified Formula Junior, and yet in practice had produced some very close and exciting racing, we now had a man's engine formula again, 3 litres, unsupercharged. I found Rob and Betty Walker having an al fresco lunch with Joe Siffert and new team partner Jack Delaca. Seppi had signed up with Rob Walker for another season. Rob was still running Coopers and was discussing the dearth of suitable engines. After the death of Charles Cooper, Roy Salvadori had been instrumental in the takeover of the Cooper Company by the Chipstead Motor Group, which had connections with Maserati. Maseratis had agreed to supply Cooper with engines for the new formula, but they just dusted down their old V12 from the 1957 250F and reworked it to 3 litres, giving around 360 brake horsepower. Although Rob had entered Seppi at Syracuse 2 weeks earlier, this was the first appearance of the works team. Australian Paul Hawkins had a Reg Parnell-run Lotus Climax. Its old 4-cylinder engine stretched to 2.7 litres. Pole had been set by Jack Brabham in his Brabham with the Repco engine, just 0.2 quicker than John Surtees' V12 Ferrari. Also sharing the front row were Jochen Rindt and Mike Spence, who got the best start with his Parnell-run 2-litre Lotus BRM. At the end of lap 1, the field was well spaced, with Brabham ahead of Surtees and Rindt oversteering slightly with that Maserati lump in the back. Then came Spence, Ginther, Siffert and Denny Hume in the second Brabham, who had to make do with climax power. Black Jack had got the only Repco V8. Next time around, it was evident that Surtees had closed up a little. To get on terms, he'd broken the new Formula One record, which Brabham had held for all of 91 seconds. Jack replied next lap with another record and drew out another couple of cars' lengths. To John Surtees had fallen the honour of winning the first ever 3-litre Formula One race at Syracuse 2 weeks earlier, but much to Scuderia Ferrari's chagrin, there was nothing he could do without Brabham at Silverstone, and Jack went on to win by 8 seconds, with Joe Bonnier third in his own Cooper Maserati and Denny Hume fourth. After the high-powered and high-pressured International Formula One trophy, it was pleasant to return to Silverstone just a fortnight later to enjoy again the relaxed atmosphere of the Aston Martin Owners Club annual Horsefall Trophy. The weather was good and the paddock packed with a variety of interesting cars, both ancient and modern. They ranged from stripped-down vintage 850cc Singers to the latest twin-cam Lotus and Brabham single-seaters. John Axon's clean Cobra-engine Cooper was destined for the Formula Libre race. If a Ford V8 can fit so snugly in a Cooper, why does the Formula One team car have to be so untidy? More heavy metal was Alan Stubbs' fearsome Attila Chevrolet. Chevron are beginning to make a name for themselves with small-capacity sports cars. Ron Fry's Ferrari 250 LM was a delight to behold, and to demonstrate the variety, an Austin 7 Special. After some pretty ugly plywood chassised cars, Marcos are now producing a stylish Cortina GT engined 1600. The lineup of pre-war Astons for the Horsefall Trophy race looked impressive, as did the DB versions scheduled for the Arthur Bryant Trophy. The first race of the day was for sports cars up to 1600cc, and Desmond Freer led in his Lotus 23 as they approached Beckett's, only for David Darby to nip inside at the hairpin with his U2, followed by Alan Harvey's Lotus Elan and sundry other Elans and Lotus 7s. Darby was soon catching the tail-enders in his immaculate Arthur Mallock-inspired U2, and it was he who ran out an easy winner. Next up came the St. John Horsefall Trophy, a handicap race for vintage and venerable Aston Martins. The handicappers, in sending the slower cars off first, try to ensure that all the drivers arrive at the end of the 10-lap race all at the same time. It never works out like that, of course, but a lot of head-scratching does go on by the organising committee to make sure that the competitors don't sandbag during practice in an effort to gain any unfair advantage. The scratch man, who has to wait till everyone else is gone and then catch them up, was once again John Freeman in the famous Spa Special, a car that the late Jock Horsefall himself had driven in his own day. Finally away, Freeman did set the fastest lap of the race at 78 miles an hour, but in the 10 laps was unable to catch everybody. He did, however, rush by 2 of the novices as he passed the pits on lap 5. The checkered flag duly came out for winner Bill Sewell, who had outfoxed the handicappers with his quite standard short chassis 2-litre of 1938 vintage. Freeman finished third behind Hugh Sinnott's 1932 Le Mans, having blasted past 10 of the other 12 runners. By way of complete contrast, the next race was for modern saloon cars, and the Australian Doc Murfield powered off into the lead in the so-called fraud Cortina, a humble British family car transformed by the shoehorning of a full-house 4.7-litre Ford V8. The Minis and Anglias played behind, but there was not a lot they could do about the fraud Cortina. DJ Ed Stewart presented Doc Murfield with the Radio London Trophy. Next came the Arthur Bryant Trophy, another handicap, this time for DB Aston Martins. The ex-Gene Bloxham DB3S Coupe has now been rebuilt and resprayed blue and was driven by Bill Monk. Clive Aston's DB3S led David Ham's DBR1 into Beckett's in a bunch of sports racing DBs. Fastest car in the field, and for me undoubted star of the day, was Colin Crabb in the Project 212 special-bodied DB4 GT, the car Graham Hill and Richie Ginther had driven at Le Mans in 1962. Clive Aston, whose name is a coincidence, was the fastest of the DB3Ss, being 4th quickest Aston of the day, and he finished the race in 7th place, behind Colin Campbell's DB2. David Ham's shapely 1959 DBR1 finished 2nd overall, behind the limit man Mike Ward in VMF 63, who at this stage was leading Bill Monk, Clive Aston and Colin Campbell. Traditionally, the Emu Wines Trophy goes to the fastest lap made in this race, and Colin Crabb took that in the 212 with a time of 1 minute 8.6, 84.3 miles an hour. The Project 212 car had run with the leaders at Le Mans in 1962, only to be sidelined with engine trouble after just 6 hours. That race was won by Phil Hill and Oliver Gendebien, sharing a Ferrari 330. Next race of the meeting was the WD and H.O. Wills Trophy, another 10-lap handicap for vintage and venerable cars, with a special class for 1.5-litre Astons, including the famous Green Pea. The scratchman was Morley with his 8-litre Bentley, but fastest lap was again put up by Freeman in the Spa Special Aston, and the race was won by Skinner in Jack Petter's Le Mans. A fine selection of modern sports cars turned out for the Monte Cristo Cigars Trophy, including a now not-so-modern D-type Jaguar, a Bentley Special, and the latest in hairiness, the AC Cobra. On the front row were Harvey Bailey's E-Type, Colin Crabb in Project 212, Bob Waters in an Elva BMW, and Ron Fry on pole in his well-known 250LM. The 250LM is Ferrari's first attempt at a rear-engine GT car. In fact, it's really a 250p sports racer with a roof on, and caused Maranello a lot of trouble getting it homologated. Fry got away well as the flag fell, as did David Ham in the DBR1 from the second row. At the end of the first lap, Fry had a huge lead, and Ham had managed to hold on to second place ahead of Harvey Bailey, Crabb, and the rest of the field. Ron Fry ran out the winner, but Ham was unable to capitalize on his good start and was duly overhauled by first Crabb in Project 212 and then Waters' Elva, who thus took second and third. It seems to me there's something of a craze now in Britain for fitting big American V8s into lightweight British single-seaters and running them in Formula Libre events. The field for the Onyx Trophy race contained two such hybrids, although David Preston had put his white 1500cc twin-cam Brabham on pole, and he led from the start. By the time they got to the hairpin on the first lap, John Axom's Cooper Cobra was alongside and ready to take advantage along the club straight. Next time around, Axom led by 2 car lengths, with Alan Smith's Attila Chevrolet losing touch a little in third. But this time it was Axom's turn to run wide, and Preston nipped up alongside, and they accelerated down the club straight side by side. Further down the field, play continued at undiminished pace. But finally, Axom stamped his authority on the proceedings and won the Onyx Trophy race ahead of Preston and Smith. For my next trip to Silverstone, the weather was back to a normal English summer's day. It was Martini Trophy time again. Once again, David Hobbs had been hired to drive the Team Surtees Lola, and he'd made pole position in practice the day before. Denny Hume, known to his friends as Yogi, having qualified in the wet, was way down the grid in Sid Taylor's T70. Hobbs got a lightning start, making as much space between himself and Hume as he could, while the New Zealander was stuck in the traffic and the spray. Nevertheless, Denny took up 8 places on the opening lap. Peter Sutcliffe was 9th in his GT40, and Peter Revson 11th in George Drummond's 250LM. Mike Salmon was another GT40 driver. After just 4 laps, Denny Hume was appearing in the murk behind Hobbs's leading Lola. And by lap 9, Hume was shaping up to pass Hobbs. David Prophet in his McLaren Elva was in 4th position, and Hobbs had to give best to the flying Hume, who took the lead on the 15th lap. Then Hobbs had to pit to take on some oil, dropping back to 4th place. Despite having 4-wheel drive, just a ticket in this weather, Mac Daghorn was dropping back in the unique Felday BRM. Hugh Dibley was now 3rd, but being caught by a recharged Hobbs. Not a moment too soon for everybody, the flag fell for Denny Hume, who'd overcome the atrocious conditions. Man of the match David Hobbs had fought his way back up to 3rd. As I returned to Monza for the Italian Grand Prix, I thought about the first season of 3-litre Formula One. Jackie Stewart had won for BRM in Monaco, and then John Surtees had won at Spa, where the Ferrari's power always comes in handy. From then on, it had been Brabham all the way with 4 consecutive wins. So now here at Monza, either Surtees or Stewart would have to win to prevent Black Jack taking a 3rd world title. Lorenzo Bandini was 3rd fastest of the 3 Ferraris entered, having been out-qualified by Parks and Scarfiotti. Joe Siffert was having a miserable year with Rob's Cooper Maserati. He had yet to finish a Grand Prix. As the mechanics push-started the beast, Seppi was preparing to start from the middle of the last but 1 row. His qualifying time was 4.5 seconds slower than pole sitter Jim Clark in the H16 BRM-engined Lotus. In the event, the race was won for Ferrari by a man from Turin, who only occasionally drove in Grand Prix cars. In fact, over 4 years, this was only his 6th Grand Prix, Ludovico Scarfiotti. And so Scarfiotti's victory had fulfilled the promise so ardently expected from him by the Ferrari team management. Brabham took the 1966 title, becoming the first man in history to win the championship in a car bearing his own name. Late in 1966, I motored down to Goodwood for the last time. The last time because in February that year, the Goodwood Company had announced that because of spectator safety considerations, there would henceforth be a capacity limit of 3 litres. Racing quickly fizzled out, and the British Automobile Racing Club held the last race meeting there in July. Now already in November, the place looks sad and deserted. It is amazing how quickly a place goes to rack and ruin when it's not used, and yet I could still hear the sounds of barking exhausts bouncing off the South Downs. For 18 years, the Duke of Richmond and Gordon and his team had successfully recreated the friendly, informal atmosphere of pre-war Brooklands, but speeds, safety, and perhaps professionalism had finally overtaken them.